Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. Sometimes the worst betrayal teaches you the most valuable lesson about your own worth. My name is Aaron, and this is a story of how discovering my girlfriend's true intentions saved me from a lifetime of being used by someone who never loved me at all. At 29, I work as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Sacramento and live a pretty quiet life that is stable and comfortable. When my father passed away from cancer, he left me some valuables, including his house, which was almost paid off. I found myself with more space and financial breathing room than most people my age could dream of. I met Stephanie at a coffee shop near my office, where she was working. We started talking when she noted me as a regular. After we exchanged numbers, things got serious. Our first few dates felt perfect. Stephanie was beautiful in every way describable. Those early months felt like the beginning of something real. Stephanie would come over after her shifts, and we'd cook dinner together, watch movies, and talk about our days. She seemed fascinated by my work, asking detailed questions about my clients and projects. She'd marvel at my house, saying she'd never been in a place with so much space, admiring the hardwood floors and updated kitchen my father had renovated before he got sick. About 6 months into our relationship, I learned more about her financial struggles. Her job barely covered her rent and car payment, leaving almost nothing for groceries or unexpected expenses. When her car needed major repairs, she was genuinely panicked about how to afford them. Without really thinking about it, I offered to help with the repair costs. The relief on her face was immediate and touching. She threw her arms around me, saying she didn't know what she would have done without me, that nobody had ever been so generous and caring. It felt good to be needed, to be able to solve problems for someone I was falling in love with. Over the next few months, I found myself helping with other expenses, a portion of her rent when her work hours were cut, groceries when money was particularly tight, and even a nice dress when her store's corporate team was visiting and she wanted to make a good impression. She was always grateful, always promising to pay me back when she could, though we both knew her salary made that unlikely. About a year into our relationship, when her lease was up for renewal and her landlord raised the rent by hundreds of dollars, I suggested she move in with me. It made financial sense. She'd save money, we'd get to spend more time together, and honestly, I'd gotten used to having her around. The house felt less empty when she was there. Stephanie was hesitant at first, saying she didn't want to feel like she was taking advantage of my generosity. But when I explained that having her contribute a modest amount toward utilities and groceries would actually help me out, too, she agreed. The truth was, I would have been fine covering everything, but I wanted her to feel like she was contributing rather than just being supported. Living together felt like the natural progression of a serious relationship. Stephanie had a key, helped decorate the guest room she used as a closet, and gradually her belongings filled the spaces that were empty. After 2 years together, I felt confident enough to introduce Stephanie to my extended family. My mother lived in Portland, but my uncle and aunt were local, along with several cousins. At a family barbecue that summer, Stephanie charmed everyone. That evening, my uncle pulled me aside and said he was happy to see me with someone who clearly cared about me. My aunt mentioned how nice it was that I'd found someone who compliments me. Their approval meant everything to me, especially since they'd been concerned about me living alone in my inherited big house since my father's death. By this point, I was seriously considering proposing. Stephanie and I had been together long enough to work through the typical relationship adjustments, and living together had only strengthened my feelings for her. We talked about the future regularly. It was during these future planning conversations that I started sharing more details about my financial situation. Stephanie knew I owned the house and had a stable job, but I began explaining the broader picture. My father had been a successful contractor who'd invested wisely in real estate and retirement accounts. Beyond the house, there was a trust fund that would mature when I turned 35, additional properties that generated rental income, and a life insurance policy that had paid off significant investments. I wasn't trying to brag or impress her. It felt natural to share these details with someone I was considering marrying. Stephanie would listen intently to these conversations, asking thoughtful questions about timelines and amounts. She seemed impressed by my father's financial planning and would often comment on how lucky I was to have such security. During these intimate conversations, Stephanie also shared more about her past relationship with her ex. They'd dated for almost 3 years before she met me, and according to her, it had been an increasingly toxic situation. The ex made decent money, but spent it as quickly as he earned it. She told me that her ex was controlling about her friendships, jealous of her coworkers, and had a temper that made her afraid to disagree with him about anything. Stephanie described incidents where this guy would show up at her work unannounced, accusing her of flirting with customers or male colleagues. He'd go through her phone, question her about every text or social media interaction, and make her feel guilty for wanting to spend time with anyone other than him. Toward the end of their relationship, she said he'd started pushing her during arguments and once grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises. Hearing these stories made me want to protect her even more. The contrast between her ex's controlling behavior and my approach to our relationship seemed to prove that Stephanie had found something healthier with me. I encouraged her to talk about these experiences when they bothered her, reassuring her that I would never treat her that way. But looking back now, I realized there were warning signs I completely ignored because I was so in love and wanted to believe we had something special. The first red flag should have been how often this ex came up in our conversations. When I point out that she seemed to think about her ex a lot, she'd explain that 3 years with someone leaves lasting impressions, that it was just natural to make comparisons. I accepted these explanations because I loved her and wanted to be understanding about her past. I figured that talking about her ex was her way of processing the trauma from that relationship, and that being patient would help her heal from whatever emotional damage he'd caused. Another warning sign was the gradual decline in our physical intimacy. During our first year together, our sex life had been active and satisfying. But months after she moved in, Stephanie began finding excuses to avoid physical closeness. She was always too tired from work, stressed about family issues, or not feeling well. When I tried to initiate romance, she'd redirect toward cuddling or suggest we watch a movie instead. When I asked if something was wrong or if I'd done something to upset her, Stephanie would reassure me that she just had a lower sex drive than she used to, that living together had made her feel less pressure to be physically affectionate all the time. She'd promise that things would improve once she felt more settled. I believed these explanations because I didn't want to pressure her or make her feel uncomfortable. I figured that being patient and understanding would eventually help her feel safer and more open with me. The biggest red flag, which I completely missed at the time, was her reaction to my financial information. While I thought Stephanie was showing a healthy interest in our future together, her questions were unusually detailed and specific. She'd ask about exact amounts, timelines for inheritance distributions, and whether there were any conditions or restrictions on accessing the money. She seemed particularly interested in the trust fund that would mature when I turned 35, asking multiple times whether there was any way to access it earlier and whether marriage would affect the terms. She'd also ask about the rental properties, wanting to know how much income they generated and whether ownership could be transferred or shared. At the time, I interpreted this curiosity as evidence that Stephanie was taking our relationship seriously, thinking about practical matters that would affect us if we got married. Now I understand she was gathering intelligence about everything. The revelation that shattered my world came one night in October. Stephanie had come home from a late shift at the store, eaten the dinner I'd made for her, and gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion. I stayed up working on some client files in the living room, finishing around midnight. When I came to bed, Stephanie was lying on her side, facing away from me, apparently asleep. Her phone was in her hands, screen facing up, still lit from what looked like an active text conversation. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention, but the screen hadn't gone dark yet, and I could see there were several unread messages. My intention was simply to place her phone face down so the light wouldn't disturb her sleep. But as I reached for it, I couldn't help noticing the conversation she was having. My heart rate immediately spiked. This had to be her ex-boyfriend. Why was she texting with him at midnight? And why hadn't she mentioned they were in contact again? I knew I shouldn't look, but something about the situation felt deeply wrong, and before I could talk myself out of it, I was reading the most recent messages. The conversation was clearly ongoing and intimate. The ex had written something about missing her, and Stephanie had responded that she missed him too, but needed to be patient for just a little longer. When her ex asked what she meant by a little longer, Stephanie's response stopped my heart. She had written, "I'm just waiting for his inheritance, then I'm yours." I stared at those words, reading them over and over, hoping I was misunderstanding or that this was some kind of joke I wasn't getting. But as I scrolled up through their conversation history, the context became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't a recent reconnection. They'd been talking regularly for months, maybe the entire time she'd been living with me. In one message from several weeks earlier, Stephanie had written, "He thinks I love him, but you're the one I want. I just need to get through this until I can access everything. Then we can finally be together properly." Her ex's responses were encouraging and supportive of the deception. He called her his girl and praised her for being smart about securing their future. He talked about plans they had for after she left me, places they wanted to travel with my money, and how much better their life would be once she had access to my inheritance. Some of the messages were particularly cruel. Stephanie had mocked my trusting nature and laughed about how easy it was to get me to share financial details. Reading these messages felt like being punched in the stomach repeatedly. Every sweet moment we'd shared, every intimate conversation, every time I'd helped her financially, it had all been performance. She'd been playing a character, pretending to love me while planning to rob me and return to the man she actually wanted. I sat there in the dark for almost an hour, scrolling through months of deception, feeling my entire reality crumble. The woman sleeping next to me wasn't my girlfriend, who loved me despite my average appearance and quiet personality. She was a predator who'd identified me as a target and executed a long-term con game. But after the initial shock and heartbreak, I felt clarity. For months, I'd been wondering what I could do to make her happier. Now I understood that nothing I did would ever be enough because she didn't actually want me. She wanted my money. Instead of waking her up for a confrontation, I made a different choice. I carefully placed her phone back where I'd found it and spent the rest of the night thinking about how to handle this situation strategically. Stephanie thought she was so smart, manipulating me while planning her exit strategy. But now that I knew the truth, I could turn the tables. The next morning, I acted completely normal. I made coffee, asked about her plans for the day, and kissed her goodbye before work. Stephanie had no idea that I'd discovered her scheme, which gave me the advantage of preparation and control. Over the next few days, I quietly gathered evidence. I took photos of her text conversations when she left her phone unattended and saved screenshots to a secure cloud account. I also canceled my plans to marry her. But more importantly, I decided to give Stephanie exactly what she deserved, a taste of her own medicine. If she were only with me for financial security, I would show her what life would look like without it. The following Friday evening, I put my plan into action. I came home from work looking stressed and distracted, barely acknowledging Stephanie when she greeted me. When she asked what was wrong, I told her I needed to talk to her about something serious. I explained that there had been a major problem with one of my biggest clients. They were refusing to pay for work my firm had completed, and it looked like we might have to take them to court. In the meantime, my boss was threatening layoffs, and my position might not be secure. Even worse, the legal issues were affecting my father's estate. Apparently, there were complications with the trust fund that could tie everything up for years. I told Stephanie that money was going to be very tight for the foreseeable future. I might have to get a second job, we'd need to cut back on expenses, and there was a real possibility that I could lose the house if I couldn't keep up with property taxes and maintenance costs. Stephanie's initial reaction was supportive and understanding. She hugged me, said we'd get through this together, and offered to pick up extra shifts at the store to help with expenses. I was shocked that she offered to do something. But over the next week, I started noticing subtle changes in her behavior. She stopped suggesting restaurants for dinner dates, claiming she wasn't really hungry or was trying to eat healthier. When I'd come home tired from work, she'd be less interested in hearing about my day. She started staying at the store later, saying her manager needed extra help with inventory and scheduling. By the second week of my supposed financial crisis, the changes were more obvious. Stephanie would scroll through her phone during dinner instead of engaging in conversation. She stopped cooking meals for us, saying she was too tired after work. When I'd suggest watching a movie together, she'd claim she had a headache or needed to catch up on sleep. The third week was when her true nature really emerged. Stephanie began making passive-aggressive comments about our situation. She'd sigh dramatically when I'd suggest free activities like hiking or visiting a museum. She complained about the groceries I bought, saying she was tired of eating cheap food and missed being able to afford nice meals. When I mentioned that we might need to start looking for a smaller, more affordable place to live, Stephanie became openly irritated. She said she'd grown accustomed to having space and privacy, that moving backward felt like failure. She started spending more time away from home, claiming she was visiting friends, though she never gave more details than that. By the fourth week, Stephanie was barely home at all. She'd come in late from work, go straight to the guest room where she kept her clothes, and leave early in the morning before I was awake. When we did cross paths, she was cold and distant, treating me like a roommate she didn't particularly like rather than someone she'd been planning to marry. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when I suggested we order pizza and watch a movie together. Stephanie looked at me with barely concealed disgust and said she was tired of carrying dead weight in this relationship. She said I'd become negative and stressful to be around, that she couldn't handle being with someone who couldn't provide basic stability. The next day, she asked me to sit down for a serious conversation. With no emotion or apparent regret, Stephanie told me that our relationship wasn't working anymore. She said I'd changed, become unreliable and financially unstable, and she couldn't be with someone who couldn't offer her security and a future. She was breaking up with me after 3 years because I was supposedly broke. I didn't beg her to stay or try to explain that the financial problems might be temporary. I didn't reveal that I'd been testing her or that I knew about her scheme with her ex. I simply nodded and said I understood her position, that I wanted her to be happy and wouldn't hold her back from finding what she needed. Stephanie seemed surprised by my calm reaction, maybe expecting tears or desperate pleas for another chance. When I remained composed and started discussing logistics for her moving out, she appeared almost disappointed by my lack of drama. Within a week, Stephanie had packed her belongings and moved out of my house. She claimed she was staying with a friend temporarily while looking for her own place, but I suspected she was moving directly in with her ex. Her social media activity confirmed my suspicions. Within days of leaving me, Stephanie was posting photos of herself looking happy and carefree, with captions about new beginnings and choosing happiness. She shared inspirational quotes about knowing your worth and not settling for less than you deserve. The posts that really revealed her character were the subtle digs clearly directed at me. She shared articles about successful women who refused to support unsuccessful men, memes about upgrading your life by eliminating negative influences, and photos from expensive restaurants with captions about finally being able to enjoy the finer things again. What Stephanie didn't know was that I'd never actually lost my job or my money. My client situation was solid, my position at the firm was secure, and my father's estate was exactly as it had always been. I'd simply tested whether she loved me or my financial security, and she'd failed spectacularly. About a month after she moved out, our mutual friends started mentioning that Stephanie had been asking questions about my real financial situation. Apparently, she'd heard through the social circle that I was still working at the same firm and seemed to be doing well. But by then, reality was setting in for Stephanie in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her ex was exactly the same person he'd been when they broke up years earlier, controlling, unstable, and financially irresponsible. Within 2 months of her moving in with him, friends reported seeing them argue publicly. Her ex's work was inconsistent, and he had expensive habits that consumed whatever money he did earn. Instead of the comfortable lifestyle Stephanie had planned to fund with my inheritance, she found herself working extra hours at the retail store to cover rent and utilities that her ex couldn't consistently afford. The controlling behavior that had driven her away from the ex originally returned quickly. He was jealous of her friendships, suspicious of her social media activity, and demanded to know where she was at all times. Friends mentioned seeing bruises on her arms. About 4 months after our breakup, I started receiving text messages from Stephanie. They began tentatively, "How are you doing?" and "I hope you're well," before escalating to more direct approaches. She sent messages saying she missed me, that she'd been thinking about our relationship, and that maybe she'd made a mistake in leaving. When I didn't respond to her texts, she escalated to phone calls that I didn't answer. She left voicemails saying she wanted to talk, that she'd realized how good we'd been together, and that she hoped we could work things out. I never responded to any of these attempts at contact. I'd seen exactly who Stephanie really was, and no amount of regret or loneliness would make me forget the months of deception and the cruel things she'd said about me. The final confrontation came on a Saturday morning, about 6 months after our breakup. I was in my kitchen making coffee when I heard someone knocking persistently at my front door. When I looked through the peephole, Stephanie was standing on my porch, clearly upset and probably crying. I opened the door, but didn't invite her inside. She looked terrible and immediately started talking when she saw me, saying she needed to explain something, that she'd made a huge mistake, that she realized now how much I meant to her. Stephanie claimed that leaving me had been the worst decision of her life, that she'd been confused and scared about commitment, but now she understood what real love looked like. She begged me to give her another chance, promising she would be different, that she'd learn from her mistakes and would never take me for granted again. I listened to her entire speech without interrupting, watching her perform emotions that might have been genuine, but were also completely irrelevant. When she finished talking and looked at me expectantly, I told her the only truth that mattered. I said, "You left when I pretended to have nothing." That told me everything I needed to know about what I meant to you. Stephanie's face went through several expressions. She started to protest, to explain, to make excuses, but I was already closing the door. I left her standing on my porch, finally understanding that her scheme had been exposed and her safety net was gone forever. That was the last time I saw or spoke to Stephanie. I heard through friends that she and her ex broke up violently, that she moved back in with her parents, and eventually left the city altogether. I don't know where she ended up, and I don't care. Looking back on those 3 years, I realized that I was never in a real relationship. I was being farmed for resources by someone who saw me as a mark rather than a partner. Every intimate moment, every shared experience, every time she said she loved me was part of an elaborate performance designed to separate me from my father's money. The most painful part wasn't discovering her betrayal. It was realizing how completely I'd been fooled. I pride myself on being analytical and careful, but love had made me blind to obvious red flags and willing to accept explanations that should have raised more questions. But I also learned something valuable about my own worth. For too long, I believed that my financial stability was the most attractive thing about me, that someone like Stephanie was doing me a favor by being with an average guy who happened to inherit some money. Her scheme actually proved the opposite, that I deserved someone who wanted me for who I was, not what I could provide. I thought losing Stephanie would be devastating, but it turned out to be liberating. I'd been carrying the weight of someone else's deception without realizing it, making excuses for behavior that should have been unacceptable, and compromising my own happiness to maintain a relationship that was never real. Sometimes the worst betrayal becomes the greatest gift. Stephanie's scheme didn't destroy my life. It freed me from wasting any more of it on someone who never deserved my love in the first place. If you're in a relationship where your partner seems more interested in what you can provide than who you are, where love feels conditional on your ability to maintain a certain lifestyle, pay attention to those feelings. Real love doesn't require you to audition for someone's affection or compete with their backup plans. Everyone deserves a partner who chooses them consistently, who values their character over their assets, who sees their love as the prize rather than seeing them as the consolation. Don't settle for being someone's security blanket while they wait for something better to come along. I'm grateful now for the lesson Stephanie taught me, even though she never intended to. I learned that my worth isn't measured by what I can provide for someone else, and that the right person will love me for who I am rather than what I have. That's a lesson worth more than any inheritance. Thank you for watching.